All right, so let's take a look at some of the determinants of aggregate demand that are going to actually shift that aggregate demand curve. And there are four of them. And you'll recognize them because they're the same thing as the components of gross domestic product. First one is consumption. Second one is gross private investment, IG. Third one is government spending. And the fourth one is net exports, XN, which is exports minus imports, or X minus M. Now we're going to take a look at all four of these variables and what effect they have on aggregate demand. So let's start off with consumption. Consumption is household spending, and that is affected by various things. Consumer wealth. Okay, more wealth means more spending, aggregate demand shifts to the right. Less wealth means less spending, aggregate demand shifts to the left. Consumer expectations will also affect consumption. So positive expectations means you're going to have more spending, aggregate demand shifts to the right. Negative expectations are going to mean less spending, so aggregate demand shifts to the left. Notice consumer wealth, consumer expectations. These are a couple of the determinants of consumption and saving that we talked about last lesson. Those determinants are going to change the amount of consumption, and the change in the amount of consumption is going to change aggregate demand. Household indebtedness. Less debt, people are going to feel bolder. More spending, aggregate demand shifts to the right. More debt, less spending, people feel a little scared. Aggregate demand shifts left. Taxes, less taxes, more spending, people have more take-home pay to spend. So aggregate demand shifts to the right. More taxes, less spending, aggregate demand shifts to the left. This is particularly important when it comes to taxes on spending, like let's say a sales tax. So sales tax, because it is a tax on spending, is going to affect aggregate demand. There are also taxes that will affect supply, but that's going to affect aggregate supply, and we're going to talk about that more at a later date. But taxes that are going to affect spending are going to change aggregate demand. So once again, household indebtedness and taxes are also a couple of the determinants of consumption and saving. And all of those are those are sub-determinants, if you will, and those are going to affect the amount of consumption in the economy, and the amount of consumption in the economy is going to affect aggregate demand. All right, so let's move on from consumption. Let's go to gross private investment. So investment spending is sensitive to various things. The real interest rate. So a lower real interest rate, we're not looking at nominal, we're looking at real interest rate, is going to mean more investment because it is cheaper to borrow and to invest. And so that's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Higher real interest rate means less investment because it's more expensive to borrow and to invest. So less investments are going to be profitable. So you have less investment, and aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. Now, the real interest rate isn't the only thing that will affect gross private investment. Gross private investment is also going to be affected by expected returns on the investment. So higher expected returns means more investment. Aggregate demand shifts to the right. Lower expected returns is going to mean less investment. Aggregate demand shifts to the left. Now, these expected returns are influenced by various things. You have expectations of future profitability, technology, the degree of excess capacity, the amount of existing capital that you have. So remember, when we're talking about investment, we're talking about spending on things like tools, factories, technology. Okay, that is basically what investment is. It's spending on those things, okay, to create more capital there. Now, if you already have a lot of capital, then you do not necessarily need to invest to create more capital. So if you have an existing stock of capital that's pretty robust, you won't necessarily see as much investment in order to create more capital in the future. And then you also have business taxes. So taxes on gross private investment are going to decrease the amount of gross private investment. If you cut taxes on gross private investment, that's going to increase the amount of gross private investment because you're going to get higher expected returns. Now, going on to government spending. So more government spending is going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Less government spending is going to shift it to the left. That one is very, very simple. Then the last determinant here of aggregate demand is net exports. So net exports are sensitive to various things. They're very sensitive to exchange rates, the international value of money. So if you have strong money, that's going to be more imports, fewer exports. Aggregate demand shifts to the left. So if you have really strong money, it's very expensive for people in other countries to buy your stuff because their money does not buy as much of your stuff. Okay, so therefore you're not going to have very many exports because other people in other countries can't afford your exports. However, because you have strong money and they have weak money, you can eat more. It's cheaper for you to import their stuff because your money will buy more goods in the currency of the weaker currency. So you're going to have more imports. So more imports, fewer exports means net exports are going to go down, which means aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. Now, weak money, okay, if there is weak money, you're going to have more exports because people in other countries with their currency, they can buy more of your goods because your goods are cheaper because you have weak money and their money is stronger. So that means you're going to have more exports as people in other countries buy our cheaper goods. However, when we have weak money, it's more expensive to buy imports because our money does not buy as many goods overseas. So we're not going to import as much due to that weak money, or even in the United States, a weak dollar. So we have more exports, we have fewer imports. That's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Now you also have relative income. So strong foreign economies means that those foreign economies are going to buy our stuff, more exports, aggregate demand shifts to the right. Weak foreign economies are not going to buy our stuff, less exports, aggregate demand shifts to the left. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and give you some scenarios here. You tell me what happens to aggregate demand, okay, and then what is the determinant. So the first one, it says, let's say the federal government passes a stimulus package that has a whole lot of government spending in it. So you should be saying to yourself that is going to be government spending. That's more government spending. So aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. You're going to have an increase in aggregate demand. Next scenario, let's say you have the expectation of a long recession. That expectation of a long recession is going to drop the amount of consumption because it is a negative expectation, and those expectations influence the amount of consumption. Okay, so we have a drop in consumption that causes aggregate demand to shift to the left. So when I'm asking you about the determinant, you don't need to give me the sub-determinants. Just tell me, is it government spending, gross private investment, consumption, or net exports that is affected, and how does that affect aggregate demand? Now let's say we've got, for scenario 3, you've got China, India, other foreign countries are doing very well economically. That affects net exports. Net exports are going to go up, which means aggregate demand is going to go up. Now for the last one here, let's say the federal government does a tax increase. Now, some of that depends upon what they're actually taxing, but assuming that they are taxing consumption, then that is going to affect consumption. It's a drop in consumption, which means a drop in gross domestic product. If they are taxing gross private investment, that would drop gross private investment, and once again, you'd have an aggregate demand drop. All right, so let's move on to the assessment here. So for number 1, we're going to describe the 4 determinants of aggregate demand. For number 2, we're going to describe 3 scenarios that would increase aggregate demand and 3 that would decrease aggregate demand. And we're going to graph that increase and decrease in aggregate demand. So for example, a scenario you might come up with might be people have less debt. Less debt means you're going to have more consumption. More consumption means more aggregate demand, and the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right, and you're going to go ahead and graph that. So you can use that as your first scenario. Then you're going to go ahead and come up with 2 more on your own, and then go ahead and graph that increase and decrease in aggregate demand. So if you need to take your time and pause here, that's perfectly fine. Otherwise, we'll move on. And so for the summary in a paragraph, describe what you learned today. I'll check these tomorrow. You have a good one. Bye-bye.